depressing outcomes from the formal COP. Even the IMF and World Bank are going to countries in Africa and Latin America and Asia and saying, here, build more fossil fuels. Saudi Arabia, previously the US, Russia, who don't want to move forward on fossil fuel phase out. 8 million people die a year just from fossil fuel air pollution alone. More fossil fuel projects
Mhm.
means more loss and damage. We need countries to be standing up to the companies, starting to sue them, starting to hold them accountable. President Petro announced his support for the fossil fuel treaty. He said, we know we're making the problem worse every single day. Governments need to be setting policies which stop expansion. We're currently on track to produce 120% more oil, gas, and coal than is consistent with the Paris Agreement by 2030. More fossil fuel projects
Mhm.
means more loss and damage. The
Mhm.
industry is spending millions of dollars to try and convince people that we are dependent on fossil fuels.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Science Talk. I'm your host, Dr. Mohammed Ittifaq. Today, I'm talking with Tzepora Berman, a chair of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. Tzepora and her colleagues have been working over the several years now to design some framework or some sort of framework by which we can phase out or maybe completely switch off fossil fuel industry. Our fossil fuel overall, as we know, the coal, gas, and oil, which has been polluting our environment over the last few centuries, and we have been relying on it 100% and more so. The global north rich countries have done a lot of things, and now there are conversations happening that we need to phase out from fossil fuel. And one of the conversation that where it happens is a COP, and that's Conference of Parties, which happens almost every year over the last almost 30 years now. And it just happened maybe ended 2 days ago, from 10 to 21st of November in Belém, Brazil, where they've been talking about how the world is going to end the climate crisis. So today we are going to have a discussion with Tzepora Berman, who she is acclaimed author. She has been a very active advocate for ending the fossil fuel. So she has received several awards, written several books, and you're familiar with her work as well. And the website, I think, goes with, if I'm not wrong, I'm just looking at fossilfueltreaty.org. You can definitely check out the work they've been doing over the last several years. And she has also delivered several TED Talks talking about. I just kind of did my research before we talk. So, Azpura, thank you so much for coming on the show and welcome to Science Talk.
Thanks for having me.
So I hope I said everything correctly about you and your work and the organization you're leading. You're the chair. So can you start us talking a little bit about COP30? We have to talk about COP30 and just start us from there. What happened? Did you leave the conversation as a hopeful person that like, yes, we are making progress and meaningful progress and how we get rid of fossil fuel? And who did you meet there? What was the conversation like?
Well, that's a big conversation. It was a very intense COP, Conference of Parties, and in some ways, a very different one from the previous conferences of parties. I have to say, this is, I think, my 17th COP, and the shocking thing about the climate negotiations is that for really 26 years, the world managed to have climate negotiations without actually ever talking about fossil fuels. In fact, I think my TED Talk was revealed that the Paris Agreement didn't even include the words oil, gas, or coal, or fossil fuels. And it's shocking considering that 86% of the emissions trapped in our atmosphere today come from three things: oil, gas, and coal. But in some ways, given the power and influence of the fossil fuel industry on these COPs and on climate policy in general, it's not surprising that their products have been invisible. We started breaking through on that in Glasgow And then again in Dubai, when 190 countries signed the text that acknowledged that we need a phase out of fossil fuels. But really, this was the first COP in this COP in Belém where how we're going to ensure a phase out of fossil fuels was really the predominant conversation at the COP. And that's really important. Unfortunately, we had some depressing outcomes from the formal COP. There was conversation about a roadmap away from fossil fuels, and in fact, 80 countries supported the idea of a roadmap away from fossil fuels inside COP. But when the final text was delivered a couple of days ago, again, the words fossil fuels were scrubbed right out of it. And I would end it there by saying, and therefore COP was a failure, but it actually wasn't because a couple of things happened that are important. One is that there were big negotiations over a just transition mechanism that could recognize the differences that different countries in the global north and global south have in trying to assure a just transition. And at one point, there was a framework put on the table by the EU, the JTAP, that was quite weak, didn't recognize equity and fairness and the need for more support in the global south. And then there was another framework put on the table by the G77, and that was called the BAM. And that mechanism for just transition was the one that passed. So you actually saw on the floor of the United Nations when the president acknowledged that it was passed, is countries, especially in Africa and Latin America and Asia, standing up and applauding that there was now a framework and a mechanism to start talking about how to ensure a just transition. Unfortunately, the fossil fuel roadmap didn't make it in. However, due to the work of Colombia and many of the countries that have been participating in the discussions over the last couple of years to create a fossil fuel treaty, which is an initiative I chair, the president, for the first time, the president of COP acknowledged those efforts and welcomed Colombia's announcement that they will host the first ever diplomatic conference on fossil fuel phase out in April next year. So, interestingly enough, this is a diplomatic conference outside the UN system. And it is a kind of coalition of the willing that's forming now about 25 countries that have signed what's called the Belém Declaration, which is a declaration on fossil fuel phase out that's stronger than what was being discussed at COP. But this isn't without historical precedent. When you look at other intransigent issues within the UN system where there were incumbent countries that were holding things back, which is what we're seeing at COPs, Saudi Arabia, previously the US, Russia, who don't want to move forward on fossil fuel phase out, they stand to benefit from further fossil fuel production. When you look throughout history, you see that many intransigent issues started with a coalition of the willing outside of COP. So, like Canada hosting the Ottawa Convention on landmines was again a convention, a diplomatic convention outside COP, set the table for the landmine negotiations. So the COP presidency kind of built a bridge between what has happened or hasn't happened inside COP and acknowledged this process outside COP. So now all eyes really turn to Santa Marta in April, where the countries who want to create a cooperative framework on how to move away from fossil fuels will gather and start working on issues like what could a fossil fuel treaty look like? What are the mechanisms inside it to support cooperation? And also issues like fossil fuel subsidies and other issues.
So, yes, honestly, I was shocked when I heard your TED talk that the word fossil fuel was not mentioned in the Paris Agreement. And I was thinking, like, we've been celebrating Paris Agreement. We thought it was a good thing that, yes, there is something, an agreement, the world is going to take some sort of action, tangible action, that we're going to solve this problem. But I'm so surprised and shocked that without fossil fuel, we've been talking about climate change all along, all those years, and still it didn't make to the final draft. And now we're creating another conference for the same problem the same conference couldn't solve. And obviously, you know what? We have to have another, as you said, it's not unprecedented, it has done before. And I just want to ask you, so the final version of this COP30 was not again including the word fossil fuel again, right?
It did not.
It did not. Okay. So also, is it fair? in your assessment, you have, numbers of years of experience. Is it fair to blame just Russia and the Saudi Arabia? Of course, they're the biggest producers, but the countries who have polluted the most and they did not even go to the conference of parties. Like, for
Yeah, yeah.
example, this year, the United States, like in totality, they're the largest emitter, and they did not even go there.
Well, and actually right now, I would say if you look at who's expanding
Mhm.
fossil fuel production the quickest, you see that it is a number of global north countries. The US far faster than any other country in the world. In fact, the majority of expansion of oil and gas this year and moving into the next 5 years will be in the United States. And then looking at the 10 years since the Paris Agreement was signed, my own country, Canada, the US, Australia, and Norway, these four countries all increased oil and gas production since they signed Paris by 40%. So it really is the global north countries who have benefited from the fossil fuel era so far, and in terms of big boosts to their economy because of production, but are also responsible for the majority of the pollution that's trapped in our atmosphere causing climate change. They're still the ones that are expanding the quickest. But I do want to address one thing that you said about Paris, because we see the fossil fuel treaty as a companion to the Paris Agreement. And that, again, is not without precedent. There actually isn't any issue within the UN system, nuclear, landmines, which doesn't have more than one mechanism or more than one treaty for different aspects of the issue. And let's be clear, fossil fuels underpin industrial society, our heating, our transportation, our electrical systems. The idea that one document, one treaty could manage it all is just simply not true. And while Paris hasn't been successful in reducing global emissions, we know for sure without the Paris Agreement, we would be in a far worse situation. So we have to remember that we're now, say, on track. If you look at current policies for somewhere around a 2.7-degree warming, we were on track for a 5-degree warming without those policies. And the other important thing, so we've slowed emissions growth. We haven't turned the corner, but we've slowed emissions growth, and that happened in part because of Paris. And then the other important thing that's happened is since Paris, we've proven that it is possible to fuel the world affordability in an affordable way with renewable energy. So, because of, in part, policy certainty, all these countries submitting their nationally determined contributions, what's known as NDCs,
Mhm.
and putting on the table policies to reduce emissions and since Dubai, a commitment to triple renewables, what we've seen is the price of renewables has dropped in a shocking way. So in 10 years, we've seen a 50% reduction in price for solar, over 50% reduction in price for wind, and a 90% reduction in battery storage. And electric cars have taken off even faster
Mhm.
than that.
Yeah.
So this year, 1 in 5 cars sold on the planet will be electric. Now, all of that movement in building solutions that can replace fossil fuels, a lot of that happened because of the Paris Agreement. So this is not to say that the
Yeah.
Paris Agreement was a failure. But to say that we need a companion to it, a work plan on how to phase out fossil fuels in a cooperative way in order to help meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. It's not about throwing Paris away, it's about adding new tools to the toolbox.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. It's not completely failed, but it was not super successful either. So it was like kind of somewhat we've been successful with that. So you mentioned a couple of countries, and I think Norway is a really kind of weird example where
Mm.
they are almost 100% or 90% renewable, but they also produce more oil and gas and coal to export to other countries. So who's the problem here? Is it like for your own country? It's like, yeah, we're gonna like have a nice air and everything, but let's sell it to Pakistan or India or Bangladesh where they cannot meet their energy demands. So who's the problem here? Is it the seller or the buyer? Because it's kind of it's a situation where one is a victim, I would say, if you we can use that word, that those countries do not have any other choice. They cannot do those things without relying on these dirty energy sources. Like those are poor countries, right? So where is the problem now?
the problem is squarely the fossil fuel industry. And in that sense, I would say it is also the fossil fuel rich producers who continue to produce. If you go back to the basics, for many, many years, it was believed that it's all about demand.
Mhm.
Well, people are using it, so we have to provide it. This was a fallacy that the industry was using in order to justify their continued production of products that are literally killing us. What a lot of people don't realize is set aside climate change. Fossil fuels are the greatest cause of premature death on the planet. 8
Mhm.
million people die a year just from fossil fuel air pollution alone. Let alone when you add lethal humidity, droughts, and fires, then it's more like one person every minute, according to the new Lancet report. So these products are killing us. We've known that for decades. The industry knew that. Their own science reports from Exxon and Shell and beyond say that they knew that. They denied climate change for many years. They pumped money into alternative scientific reports to question climate change. And then they pumped money into lobbying and advertising campaigns to slow down climate progress. And even at this COP, 1 in 25 delegates on the floor of COP30 were from the fossil fuel industry. So they've overwhelmed processes. They can do this because they're the most profitable industry in the history of the planet.
Mhm.
The oil and gas industry makes about $2.8 billion a day in pure profit every day for the last 50 years. So they have the capacity to overwhelm scientific processes, to overwhelm lobbying processes. But let's get back to the wealthy producing countries. For many years, wealthy countries have been saying, not our responsibility. The markets will decide who gets to produce. We just have to reduce emissions. That's what you still hear from Canada, from Australia, from Norway. The fact is, though, that even the industry this year is acknowledging that oversupply is creating demand. It's not helping to meet
Mhm.
demand, it's creating demand.
Creating
So
demand.
as they pump more and more fossil fuels and build more fossil fuel infrastructure, that is creating a dependency on continued fossil fuel use at a time when renewable energy at scale is viable. But the big problem is that renewable energy requires a capital outlay to build the infrastructure, the electrification, etc. After that, no one owns the sun and the wind. The
Mhm.
sun isn't going to send you a
Yeah.
bill at the end of the month. So those same big wealthy countries and companies don't actually want to do it at scale because they can't make you dependent on it. They can't continue to make record profits after it's built because no one owns the sun and the wind. But that's why it's a more equitable and and fair and
Mhm.
pathway for energy security, and it leads to less dependence.
Yeah.
So we have a problem with the fact that renewable energy, while escalating quickly, is not replacing fossil fuels because the big producing countries keep continuing to dump
Yeah.
more fossil fuels on the market, and the companies want to as well. And we also have a problem with capital not going into the global south. So 98% of renewable energy capital last year went into the global north, not the global south. So all these companies and
Mhm.
countries, and even the IMF and World Bank, are going to countries in Africa and Latin America and Asia and saying, here, build more fossil fuels at a
Yes.
time when we know we need to phase them out.
Mhm.
In fact, last year, the IMF required, as part of its loan guarantees, that countries who export fossil fuels show that they're going to increase those exports. So we
Wow.
have structural problems within the financial system that continue to
Mhm.
support fossil fuel production and dependency, even though the solutions are at hand. And a lot of the wealthy countries, and of course China, who's investing heavily in fossil fuel
Mhm.
production outside of its own borders,
Yeah.
are responsible for trying to, for extending the life
Mhm.
of the fossil fuel industry when it should be shrinking, given that renewables are cheaper.
Yeah. I
So
think. Mhm. Go ahead.
the the solution to that is international cooperation on new financial mechanisms. And that's what we're looking at under the Fossil Fuel Treaty. So we now have 18 countries who are at the table participating in developing the treaty. And I think that number is going to grow substantially this year now that the April Santa Marta conference is on fossil fuel phase out. I think a lot of countries are going to come to that and see what's happening at the table
Mhm.
of the fossil fuel treaty negotiations and want to join. So, so you can't negotiate the terms of the treaty unless you're participating formally in the process.
Yeah.
So this conference is about not just about the treaty. It's much larger, but I think it will drive more countries into the treaty negotiations. At the table, we're looking at mechanisms that are being developed by finance experts from the Global South, like a debt resolution facility. So that would offer coordinated, concessional, outcome-based financial restructuring between countries and in multilateral spaces, and that would help provide solutions to debt. I mean, look, there are a lot of
Yeah.
countries like Ecuador, drilling for new oil in the heart of the Amazon just to feed their debt. So we have to deal with debt if we're going to be asking countries in the global south to not expand fossil fuel
Yeah,
infrastructure.
and I think you're right. The fossil fuel industry system or mechanism is very much tied to the financial systems of the world, and we have to tackle that simultaneously as we're dealing with this problem. But like one thing you're saying, and that very interesting to me, is that are we trying to separate companies from countries because those companies exist within countries, right? So for example,
Yeah.
ExxonMobil is a company based in some country. Shell is based in somewhere. Aramco is based in some country. So why are we not talking more about the country level thing than blaming these companies? Because these companies are not existing in the vacuum. They say like, oh, we don't abide by any rules. We don't exist in any other countries. We just out in the space or like deep in the ocean. This land doesn't belong to anyone. So why is that? Is it a good idea or a bad idea that we are separating these companies from countries, or like should we talk this way, or there's another different way to put it?
We need countries to be standing up to these companies, to be holding them to account. And we're starting to see that, especially with the International Court of Justice ruling last year, which provides now kind of legal teeth
Yeah.
to recognizing the company's responsibilities for climate harms, and recognizing that any new production at this point in our history will cause climate harm. And so that provides new legal tools. And since the decision, there's been a plethora of lawsuits filed. And I think we're going to see more countries, more states, provinces, cities suing the companies and distancing themselves from the companies. It's hard to do because the
Yeah.
companies have spent literally 50 years integrating into our political systems and building up their power within the political systems and even funding
Yeah.
candidates in political elections.
Yeah.
And
So,
the other reason it's tricky is that you also have national oil companies, Petrobras in Brazil and many others. And so I think what we need is two things. We need countries to be standing up to the companies, starting to sue them, starting to hold them accountable, drawing back those subsidies that we're giving them. Let's not forget, we're giving trillions of dollars of public money to these companies every year in the form of subsidies. Those subsidies need to be drawn back, and we need to be making the polluters pay. And what that means is increasing the royalties that oil companies and others are responsible for to nation states, taking percentages of their profits. Because what these companies have been doing is they're privatizing the profits and everything they get off the drilling and the fracking and the digging. And then they're socializing all the costs. They're walking away from the leaky oil wells, the uncapped wells, which are millions around the planet at this point. Canada alone has billions of dollars now in liability as a result of uncapped wells. So they're really socializing the costs. And those costs are also health costs downstream
yeah.
of oil facilities, of refineries. We're seeing rare cancers, high incidences of birth defects, etc. So, so we need to make them responsible for the costs. And then on national oil wells, in national oil companies and private companies, governments need to be setting policies which stop expansion and manage a wind down in line with Paris goals. We have to see production in light of Paris goals, not just emissions. And there's been some good work to start looking at that. The production gap report by the UN and Stockholm Environment Institute was kind of the first to socialize this idea of production being a climate responsibility and look at how to align it with Paris goals. Their most recent findings show that we're currently on track to produce 120% more oil, gas, and coal than is consistent with the Paris Agreement by 2030.
Mm.
So we have to look to those analysis and also the Civil Society Equity Review, which is the first analysis to really look at what are timeframes for production decline
Mhm.
that differentiate by equity and fairness by country. And I think that analysis is going to be very important as negotiations begin and as countries start to constrain these companies. And that leads to serious questions about trade agreements. Because what we're seeing now is as some countries or states like Quebec say no more fracking, they're being sued by the companies under ISDS rules. And so those need to be addressed, and we need to shift and our trade agreements so that countries have the ability to constrain this rogue industry.
It seems like there are too many pieces of the puzzle, like here, trade agreements to, the influence of the lobbyists and oil and gas companies and trade and financial system and all of that. How is your organization tackling all of this? This is too much. This is a too big of a problem, honestly, as you're explaining it. So how are you like kind of talking to these companies or countries to convince them or persuade them or stopping them to produce, expand, or even sell on fossil fuel?
Well, look, what's happening now is that every country in the world can see
Hmm.
the impacts of the climate crisis, and they can also see the costs.
Hmm. Yes.
What we know is that the extreme weather, the floods, the fires are now costing
Too much. Yeah.
millions of dollars every minute.
Yeah.
And so that becomes so then mitigating the climate crisis becomes an economic issue.
Mm.
Countries are also seeing now making the connection. More fossil fuel projects
Hmm.
means more loss and damage,
Yes.
means more climate crisis. And so that shift is really only, so for the first couple of years of our initiative, Fossil Fuel Treaty, we were making that case to countries. In
Mm.
fact, in Glasgow, our first campaign was it's time to say the F words at COP
Mm.
because we had never said fossil fuels. By the second and third year, we were meeting with countries constantly, explaining the production gap to them, explaining to them how any new fossil fuel projects that's proposed are not in line with 1.5. And many of the Pacific Island nations, the African nations, Latin American countries, Asia, these global South countries fought for 1.5 because they know it means
Yeah.
their survival. And so when they realized that new fossil fuel projects are not in line with 1.5, it made them angry and they started to get more involved. So I don't think at this point we're building the fossil fuel treaty grouping from
Hmm.
the global south. And we didn't go to the major producers first. However, some major producers have signed on, like Colombia. And the leadership of Colombia, I mean, this is a country that's fifth largest coal exporter in the world. Oil exports were 60% of its export revenues last year, and they have committed to stopping expansion and managing a wind down. And when President Petro announced his support for the fossil fuel treaty, he said, "We know we're making the problem worse every single day, but
Mm.
we can't stop without more international cooperation. And that's why we need to work together to create a fossil fuel treaty." So, so in meeting with the countries and explaining the connection to them that has been invisible throughout history and why it's so important, and then starting to chart solutions pathways to addressing their concerns. So our research department has been looking at these issues of trade, of tax, of debt, and also of how to replace export revenues.
Mm.
Because for a long time, we talked about the fossil fuel phase out just in terms of our use of fossil fuels.
Yeah.
We've been looking at the production barriers.
Mm.
So if you're a country that does a lot of exports, like Malaysia or
Mhm.
Colombia, your issue is not actually how to build enough renewable energy to keep the lights on or turn the
Mhm.
lights on in your country. Your issue is how to replace those export
Yeah.
revenues. So this year we dug in country by country and started doing analysis of how to replace those export revenues.
So you're like at the very beginning of this phase that you're building a coalition and bringing more support from different countries. So do you think would we realistically do we have enough time to keep building these coalitions and keep talking by 2080 or 2060, when it will be too late. Maybe by then, like 180 countries signed up for that, but like at that point we already reached 3 degrees Celsius temperature, and it's already too late to, maybe there are several tipping points and we have lost the battle against climate change. Or like, so how important it is for you or for the organization to kind of speed up that, like, hey, we need to move forward. We can't just do every year 50, 20,000 people get together and still we can't include one word that's a fossil fuel in the final draft, and we keep, like, encircling in that same conversation, and that real change is not happening. Do we really have that much time against climate change?
I think the mistake people make is looking at it as though it is a zero-sum game.
Mhm.
We don't have any other choice. And the any progress that we make, we convince a country like Colombia to come in and start working on this to end expansion. That saves lives.
Mhm.
Every project that we stop from going forward, every ton of carbon that we save from going into the atmosphere at this moment in history will save lives. So it's not about whether we win it all. I mean, sure, that would be great if we can bend emissions and have them go downwards and start sucking carbon from the air with healthy forests and get back to 1.5. Absolutely, that's the goal.
Mhm.
But any progress we make at this moment in history saves lives. It reduces the floods, the fires, the extreme weather that our children and our grandchildren are going to be facing in the future. So, so it's never too late to decrease the impacts of climate change. Is it too late to stop it altogether right away? Absolutely. We
Mhm.
already have enough carbon baked into the atmosphere that we know what it's going to look like 5 years from now, and we know what it's going to look like 10 years from now, and we should be preparing for that. So it's not just about working with countries to cooperate on reducing and ending expansion of fossil fuels and mitigating climate change. We also now have to be adapting to climate change to save lives. We should be encouraging our governments to put in place emergency systems, heating and cooling systems. Lethal humidity will be one of the greatest causes of death on the planet in the coming years. And we have to prepare for that and try and keep especially the most vulnerable safe. It is the elderly, the children, and
Yes.
the women
Mhm.
who are most at risk. In fact, 80% of the people displaced last year due to climate change were women. So we have to be working on adaptation, but it's never too late to reduce the impacts of climate change. And every ton of carbon matters. So I think as we get more and more countries sitting at the table, it not only starts to create mechanisms for them to stop expansion, but it starts to shift the social norm of what is acceptable. The
Mhm.
reason this was the primary conversation at COP, not just among those 20 countries, but among 190 countries, was because of the leadership of Colombia and the Pacific Island nations and those other 20 countries forcing the conversation forward when before it had been invisible. So those gains in some ways seem intangible, but
Mhm.
that's how history's made.
Yeah. Last question before I let you go is, what is something we need to talk more about fossil fuel and we're not spending as much time as we should be?
I think right now, it's actually affordability. The
Mhm.
industry is spending millions of dollars to try and convince people that we are dependent on fossil fuels. I
People,
think
you
one
mean
of
policymakers
No,
or
I think
ordinary
the
people?
average person.
Mhm. The
There are
campaigns.
ad there
Mhm.
there are advertisements everywhere, fear mongering about price and
Yeah.
scarcity. They're going to take your gas stove away.
Yeah.
If Gavin Newsom in California stops drilling, then the price of gas is going to go up for you. These things are not true.
Mhm.
Renewable energy and electrification is far cheaper for people. Again, the sun isn't going to send you a bill at the end of the month.
Mhm.
So people are afraid of change, and the industry is preying on that. But if you look at the most recent analysis by the International Energy Agency and you compare what prices will be in the future under a fossil fuel system and under a renewable system, it is way cheaper for us to move to a renewable system. It's going to make life way more affordable and not dependent on those people that are making gross profits off our backs. And so I think We have to, not only to policymakers, but to the public, talk about how it's cleaner, it's safer, and it's affordable. Because the most egregious thing the fossil fuel industry has done is to steal our imagination, to imagine a world that is cleaner and safer and more affordable without oil, gas, and coal. And we need to support people in imagining it, because if they do, they will support the hard policies that are going to ensure a transition.
Absolutely. With that, thank you so much, Tzepora Berman, once again to coming on the show and having the time to talk with me. Thank you so much.